Hi again, everybody. As I promised earlier in the last film about the Great Migration, we were going to talk about one Toledo in specific, whose Great Migration story really encapsulates a lot of stories. His story is similar to a lot of other people's stories early, but becomes very divergent and very special later. And we'll get to that divergent part near the end. So this is the story of Dr. William N. Thomas, PhD. Who, in my opinion, is one of the most exceptional Toledoans of all time. So let's talk about how he got his start in life. William Thomas was born in Moultrie, Georgia in 1912, literally on a sharecropping farm. His parents were sharecroppers in this place outside Macon, Georgia. His parents were named Saul and Agnes. He was one of 11 children, and he was the seventh child, which, as he says in just an amazing audio interview that I can share a link with you guys if you've ever got 3 hours to listen. It's really fantastic. He says that his parents said as the seventh child, it meant he was either going to be really exceptional or really terrible, and he was definitely the first one. His birth name was not William. His name was Niger Thomas when he was born. And Niger was the name of the doctor who delivered him out on their farm. And his parents wanted to honor the doctor, and so they named their son Niger. In 1917, when Niger Thomas was about 5 years old, his father, I quote, talked up and too much to the farm manager, who was white. Within a day or so, the KKK had been alerted to the fact that an African-American man had talked back to a white supervisor, and the KKK was coming for him by the next morning. This is how their story of the Great Migration begins. And if you guys remember, in our overview of the Great Migration, we talked about push factors and pull factors of migration. Push factors are things that push you out of the place you used to live. Pull factors are things that pull you to another place. Well, obviously, the Ku Klux Klan coming for your family is a push factor. And that's what's going to drive the Thomases out of Moultrie, Georgia. Now, why are they going to end up in Toledo? Saul is the first to leave. Mrs. Thomas stays down with all the kids in Moultrie for just a little while until Saul gets established. He gets up to Cincinnati. He basically hops on a freight train, which is almost impossible to do these days. But back then, you just found an open door on a train that was heading in the right direction, and you went there. And this freight train got him as far as Cincinnati. In Cincinnati, he got in touch with relatives who were up in Toledo, and then made the trek from Cincinnati up to Toledo to get a job. And about a month later, Saul Thomas sends for the rest of the family to come up to the promised land of Toledo, Ohio with him. Initially, they lived in the Out Stickney neighborhood, which, as we said in the prior movie, was one of about 4 traditionally African-American neighborhoods in the city at this time. And they lived south of Spring School. Now, you guys know where Spring School is today, at Spring and Stickney. The picture here is of the original Spring School. There have been 3 different Spring School buildings. This one burned down in the 30s, got rebuilt, and then that one got torn down and replaced with the Spring School south of Woodward that you guys are familiar with today. Saul ends up getting a job at a factory near Hamilton Street and City Park Avenue, over on the south side, south of downtown. And it's a long trip from out by Spring School all the way over to the south side of downtown by Swan Creek. So eventually he moves the family. And of course, if you're moving the family out towards Hamilton Street, you're going to end up in the old Pinewood district, right? So the Thomases, as we'll talk about in a minute, are kind of a pioneering family in the Spring Street neighborhood. So they moved to a house at 518 Hamilton. As William Thomas remembered it as an adult, he said, quote, "It was quite a ragged house. It was owned by a German family. Those Germans partied all night." And what you're looking at here is 516. There's not an auditor's picture of 518, but 518 shared a wall with 516. So you can see just 2 windows there of what was the Thomas house on Hamilton Street, across from what's going to be American Can Company later. The house that they moved into had an outside toilet. It had no electric, had no gas. There was a well near the kitchen door, and you went out and had to actually, pump water out to have water in the house. Their heating was with coal and with wood. They had a big pot-bellied furnace. You threw the wood or the coal in there and stoked it to keep it hot. They had gas lights with a mantle. So you had basically these basins that you filled up with a flammable gas. There was a cloth wick that went in there. Then there was a glass jar over the top called a mantle, and you lit those at night to have any light whatsoever in the house. Again, this is about 1918, 1919. This is not the 1800s. This is a time when most places in Toledo did have electric and did have a furnace and did have indoor plumbing, and they're living in a place that has none of the above. Now, why does it have none of the above? These houses on Hamilton were some of the original Lanks Hill homes. Remember we talked about the Germans that came here in the 1840s and 50s? These are the houses they built, and not all of them got updated 50 years later when these folks are moving in. So this is the arrival of African American families into the old Lanks Hill neighborhood. Now, I'm going to show you something that I hope blows your mind in the same way it blows my mind. I'm going to show you a couple of forms from the 1920 census. Censuses are held every 10 years. In any year that ends with a 0, we have a census in the United States. And the government goes door to door counting everybody who lives in the country. And back in the day, they kept these on these great big log sheets. And we can look at those log sheets online today, all the way up to 1940, and we can learn a lot about how people lived at the time. And they're searchable, so you can find a family like the Thomases. So we're going to look at the Thomas household, and we're going to look at their neighbors on the 1920 census. So this is what these big census sheets look like. And as you can see up here, there's a lot of information, and it's written in cursive. And my head is probably going to disappear from this in a second, as I have to get really close to the screen to point things out to you. But right down here, you can see it says 518 Hamilton Street, and right there is Saul Thomas, head of household, his wife, and then all of the children. And all the way down here is a son named Niger. And remember, he's about 8 years old at this point. It tells a lot about the family. It says that they were born in Georgia, that his father was born in Georgia, and that he was a laborer at the can factory, which was located across Hamilton Street from where the family lived. Now, the other thing you're going to notice here, there are 2 cousin-in-laws that live with the family. And then rumor. There were 20 people living in this house that had no plumbing, had no electricity, had no central heat. This was a lot of people in one house. And one of the things that you might remember from our Great Migration lecture is that one of the ways our pioneering African American families in Toledo made money was by letting out rooms to other black people who couldn't rent from white folks in Toledo. So this was a way to make some money to help keep your family afloat. Other thing I want you to notice, this register here shows the race. It shows the sex and the race and the age of everybody in the house. So you've got Saul Thomas, who is male. He is black. He's 45. Agnes is female, black, 34. So I want you to notice everybody in the Thomas house, 518 is everything between here and here. Everybody in that house is black. But then when we look at the rest of the neighborhood, all white in the houses next to them. And where are they from? Hessen in Germany. They're all Germans over here, right? We've got one that's Irish. Down here, we've got one that's Swiss and German. And if we look back at the bigger picture, this is from the top of that census page in 1920. Germany, Switzerland, Ohio, Baden, which is in Germany, Pennsylvania, Germans, Canada, Switzerland, Prussia, Germany, Württemberg, Germany, Ireland, Hesse. You get a real idea of what people did. The other thing you notice is that this was kind of a factory neighborhood. A lot of people in the neighborhood worked at the brewery. And the brewery there, if you remember, is the whole reason Lanks Hill exists. Peter Lenk had a brewery and a winery, and that's why this neighborhood existed since the 1840s. Now, by the time we get to the 1930 census, sorry about that. By the time we get to the 1930 census, things have changed. And so now, if we look, this is the same street. Here's 518. The Thomas family is all down here. They don't have as many roomers now. But if we look up and down the 500 block of Hamilton, and we look in the color or race category, black family, white families, and then black family, black family, black family. In just a 10-year span, they've gone from being the only black family on the block to being one of 4 black families on the block. So we start to see, just in these very small snapshots of how people live from the census, we start to see how the neighborhood is becoming the Pinewood district after having been Lanks Hill. Now, in the Pinewood neighborhood, where did people go to school? So the school was Gunkel. And Gunkel School was located exactly where the Jones Leadership Academy of Business is located today, right off of Collingwood. And where we've got this grand structure today stood one of the most historic schools in Toledo history. Gunkel School was, by 1930, quote-unquote, primarily black. Now, if you look at every other school in Toledo, you will see they were, quote-unquote, primarily white. And typically when you see schools that are all white and schools that are almost all black, there's some form of segregation at work. And there was in TPS at that time. TPS absolutely did segregate black students towards Gunkel School, no matter where they were from in town. Except for the east side. The east siders all kept to themselves. But anywhere on the west side of the river, black students were kind of channeled to Gunkel Elementary School. And Gunkel was the only school that had black teachers. There were 7 black teachers by 1934 in all of Toledo public schools. And every one of the black teachers was at one building, Gunkel Elementary. Poverty was really tough in this neighborhood. Thomas remembered that they would walk up and down the train tracks. And you guys know how the train tracks all come into the south end there behind the zoo. And then the train tracks, the train yards become really wide at a place called Airline Junction. You could get lucky back then. And back then trains ran on coal. And sometimes coal would spill off the back of the coal car that filled that they used to keep the engines heated to boil the water, to make the steam, to make the trains go. Coal would fall off. And Thomas says here, I remember walking the tracks trying to find coal when times were tough. So these kids would walk up and down the train tracks looking for any piece of coal that they could take home to throw in that furnace to keep the house warm. Finding fun. What did kids do for fun back then? So Gunkel Park, which still exists, kind of around Gunkel School and the church, around Jones Leadership Academy of Business and the church next door. Gunkel Park was where they hung out. And they played basketball, they played hockey, they played Cowboys and Indians along Swan Creek near Collingwood. They rode horses. They had a neighbor who had some horses, and they would ride over to Sterling Field, where there's a baseball diamond that I think nobody in town knows about, hidden on the south end, south side of Swan Creek. They'd go over to Sterling Field to pasture the horses. And in William Thomas's case, his favorite thing to do was read. This guy really, really loved to read. Now, as far as education, William Thomas used to go to the movies. He'd go to the movies up on Dorr Street. And he'd go to movies downtown where black people were forced to sit in the balcony for a very long time. And he saw this movie about a wizard and electricity, and he got fascinated with science. And he started trying to learn more and more about electricity and about science. And as he was walking back, he walks up Michigan Avenue, and he walks by what was then called Woodward Technical High School, where the main library is today. And he decided, I'm going to go to high school. Very few other people in his family had gone to school past 8th grade. And he made the decision, walking home from the movies, I'm going to go to high school. He signs the papers, and it asked for a name. And for reasons that I think are probably pretty obvious to you guys, being a young black man with the name Niger was not a really comfortable place to be in the 1920s and 1930s. And he said he had always disliked his name. And so when it asked for the name on his forms to register for school, he picked a name he liked, which was William. And he wrote William Need Your Thomas down as his name. And from that moment on, he was William Thomas. Friends called him Bill. And that's the name that most people knew him as after he was about 14 years old. And here's kind of the story of that from his from a transcript of this really great interview with him. And Mike, who he references here, is his brother. And so Mike had said, well, I'd get 50 cents a week and I'd be going to Woodward Technical High School, which was then on Jefferson and 10th Street. And so I went there, and that time I'd gotten a little bit fed up with this name of Needger. Whenever the teacher would call a roll and get to my name, I would want to crawl in a hole. Needger Thomas. And then he imitated the hee of kids in there. And I didn't have enough sense to go to any of them because I'd developed a deep inferiority complex. And so it occurred to me that I would like to have William as my name. And somehow I got it through when I went to Woodward Technical. I filled out the papers, the people felt sympathetic to me, and that's the way my name was changed. He does 1 year of technical high school, and when he is at the technical high school, trying to learn a trade, to go into the trades, he is told that a black man doesn't have a chance of getting a job in the skilled trades. So he leaves Woodward Technical and goes back to his neighborhood high school, which had just opened, Libby High School. He ends up graduating from Libby High School. His family didn't even have enough money to get a senior picture taken. And so in his senior yearbook, he is listed on Students Without Pictures with his senior quote, "What shall I do to be forever known?" William Thomas did really well in his classes at Libby. But Libby didn't do right by him. Quote, "Libby never gave me, I don't know of any teacher that took an interest to try and bring anything out of me at all. I was there, but I wasn't a part of. I didn't know where I was going or have goals of any kind." And so this exceptionally bright young man graduates Libby High School, a school that he went to but never felt like he was a part of. And he comes out of high school kind of aimless. He ends up working at a meat market at Indiana and Division Streets, kind of near where Third Baptist Church is today. And then his father, who was getting old, his father was working on the construction crews helping to build the Anthony Wayne Trail over the top of the old canal. And his dad couldn't do it on cold days because he had rheumatism and couldn't make his joints move enough to grasp the shovels and the tools. So he would put on his dad's jacket and pretend he was his dad and go down and work his dad's shifts so the family could still get that pay and still get the benefits associated with being part of the Works Progress Administration. All this time, adults in the neighborhood are pestering him to go to the University of Toledo. And we will pick up his story after the Depression. It will come as no surprise to any of you that William Thomas down at Hamilton and City Park from time to time walks a couple blocks up to Indiana and City Park to Stewart's Pharmacy. And this bright young man is going to get some good advice from Ella P. Stewart, and that's going to set him on his way in life. Guys, thanks for sticking with me through this. As always, be well.